Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel and thank you for joining me for another true crime deep dive. So this is part 2 of a multi-part series. So if you haven't seen part 1, that is linked in the description box. You should probably watch that first because 1 always comes before 2 and a lot of this won't make any sense if you don't watch that first. Like none of it will make any sense. I just wanted to pop in here really quick with a funny little story about YouTube because, a lot in life has been just absolutely upside down and bananas for, what feels like a decade, but really just, about two years. I don't know. What do you guys think? Feels like forever, but just a lot of things haven't made sense. And one of those things, though, that has never made sense, therefore they still provide some sort of stability, is YouTube. So in the first video of this series, I was demonetized the first time because apparently we, as a human race, like to forget that women have breasts, so obviously I put some photos of Michael and the tribes of Papua New Guinea in there, and then in one of those photos, a woman's breasts were showing. No true crime videos, left and right, crime scene photos, absolutely okay, go forth and prosper. However, breasts, not allowed. And so I cropped the photo. I removed the breasts. No breast. Women don't have them. Who are they? And then they hit me again for what they called bad language, foul language, because apparently saying that Michael Rockefeller graduated cum laude is bad language. So they must just be looking at the transcript, I think, at this point. I suppose part of that statement is bad language, but this is the antics and the shenanigans I deal with on YouTube. And at this point in my life, I'm too old to get agitated about these things. I just have to laugh. So I thought that you guys could laugh with me because cum laude? Oh shit, I did it again. It's over. It's over. Talked about breasts and cum laude. My channel's deleted. So in the first episode, we went over who Michael Rockefeller was and why he made the decision to leave his cushy trust fund life in New York City and fly to the most remote areas of Papua New Guinea. He spent some time with the Dani people while working on a documentary called Dead Birds, and then he set off on his own in order to visit an even more remote and uncontacted group of people known as the Asmat. But before we dive back in, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Magellan TV. If you are like me, and I think you are, and you love documentaries the way I do, and I think you do, you've probably already exhausted most of your documentary options on streaming platforms. Maybe you've even started watching some that you are really not interested in at all, but you just want to watch it to get that documentary fix. Don't do that. Don't do that. And this is exactly why you need to try Magellan TV if you haven't already. Magellan TV is a documentary streaming service founded by filmmakers. Magellan TV has more true crime documentaries than any other platform, and every week they add 15 to 20 hours of new content, so you'll never run out of something to watch. Every week I always get super excited to pop into Magellan TV's new releases category because not only do they put new true crime stuff in there all the time, but they put really awesome new history stuff in there, new science stuff. Well, we don't have an hour to talk about all of that, so if I had to recommend one thing this week to those of you who have already been watching Magellan TV or who plan to check it out, it would be Secrets in the Bones, The Hunt for the Black Death Killer. In the 14th century, the bubonic plague swept across Europe, wiping out half the population and leaving its mark as one of the most lethal killers in human history. But for more than 660 years, the cause of the Black Death has eluded scientists. Now, an evolutionary biologist embarks on an epic journey to solve this mystery. I've always been very, very interested in the bubonic plague. I actually did a semester-long research paper on it in college. Now that I think about it, I guess that I've always been a little bit dark. I remember I was serving tables at that time, so I was going to college during the day and serving tables at night, and I would be dealing with my tables, and then if I had 5 minutes free, I'd be in the back and I'm reading my bubonic plague book. It seems so odd now, but that's what it was. Anyways, Magellan TV is completely ad-free, and it can be watched anytime, anywhere on your television, your cell phone, your tablet, or your laptop. It's also compatible with Roku, which is what I use it on, Amazon Fire TV, Apple TV, Google Play, and iOS. And like I said, they don't just have true crime content. They have amazing history documentaries, science, nature, travel documentaries that will keep you entertained and educated for hours. And with an annual membership of just $59.98 a year, that's $59.98 a year, you're only going to pay $4.99 a month for 3,500 hours plus worth of amazing documentaries. And if you click the link in my description box, you can try Magellan TV out for yourself for 1 month free, no strings attached, no contracts to sign. You can cancel anytime you want, but I don't think that you're going to want to. So literally, you have nothing to lose. If you just want to see what they got, go in there, get your free month, peace out after. So thank you so much to Magellan TV for sponsoring today's video, and let's dive in. All right, Michael Rockefeller. This is a young man that I still don't know. I don't know how I feel about him. I don't know how I feel about people like him, people who were doing the things that he was doing with these tribes, with these remote and uncontacted people. I can't figure out if the knowledge that was gained from being around these uncontacted tribes and peoples was worth the impact that it had on the people. I just can't figure it out. I've been trying to for weeks. I've been going back and forth. By the end of this series, that is a question that I want to kind of talk to you guys about and maybe even go live and talk about, because I can't settle on how I feel about it. I go back and forth, kind of like when I was watching The Staircase, the documentary about Michael Peterson, and I was like, he's super nice. I want this dude to be my dad. He's a great dad. But then I'm like, I'm pretty sure he's a killer, allegedly. So this was not going to be Michael's only trip into Asmat territory. Filming on dead birds had not wrapped up yet, so his plan was to take 3 or 4 weeks and use that time as a hiatus from the documentary, just to go and visit Asmat territory and see what they were all about and what they had to offer. Michael wasn't going to just go all willy-nilly into the wild, though, without having any idea of what was in store for him. He had contacted the Dutch New Guinea Department of Native Affairs, and they had assigned Michael a man named René Wassing, an anthropologist who'd been working in Hollandia, but he himself had never been to Asmat territory before. Now remember that Hollandia is a Dutch post in New Guinea, so that's where René was working, but he'd never really sort of gone out into the wild before. But he is Michael's guide for this. On June 22nd, 1961, Michael and René arrived at a government post in Piramapun. Okay, so quickly, I'm sure that's not how you pronounce it. This is an Asmat village. It's in Asmat territory, and that's where they have a government post, so it's sort of on the outskirts. But because that village name is in the Asmat language, which we already kind of discovered from the first video when Carl Hoffman, the author, was telling us they have all these different tenses and it's very complex language, there's no way you can look up and see how it's pronounced, So I'm sure I didn't pronounce it right, and I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce every Asmat village I talk about. Just give me some grace and be patient with me, because I'm really trying very hard. And I'll actually put up the way they're spelled when I'm talking about this in the video, and then you guys can tell me in the comments how you think it's pronounced, and we'll make a fun game of it. Maybe I'll have some people who are familiar with Asmat culture who actually know how to pronounce these things, and then it's just the more you know, rainbow. All right, so here's something you need to understand about the Asmat. They were very cut off from the modern world at this time. They had never seen or tasted alcohol. They only drank the river water, or maybe some water from a coconut or the sago tree if they could get their hands on it. And they were introduced to tobacco through the white man, and they actually would become quite addicted to it, but they could still only get it through trade with the white man. So it would hold a lot of value to them, tobacco, as would stone axes, because stone also wasn't something they had a lot of in their area of the world. They also didn't really have pottery of any sort because, remember, I told you this whole area is pretty much flooded all the time. So the clay in their area, it was just too wet, too muddy to really do anything with. So they would cook everything over an open flame. Now, according to Adrian Gerbrands, the deputy director of the Dutch National Museum of Ethnology, Asmat villages usually consist of a string of houses facing a river and separated from the river by a footpath. And their houses, they stand on poles, which raise them above the mud, and they also add extra protection against enemies, being a little bit elevated. Now, remember from our talk about the initiation ceremony of a young Asmat man, he lived in a bachelor house. That house is called a ewe, and it's very important to Asmat culture and to the social structure of each village. This is where the men spend most of their time during the day. They talk, they discuss important matters, they hang out, they unwind, they perform ceremonies and rituals here. And it's funny because in one documentary I watched about the Asmat people, they said, gender roles are very set within these people. Like the women do the gathering and taking care of the families, basically everything, and the men are there to protect and be like warriors. But since they aren't really in the olden times where they have to like fight against each other anymore, and the government has put a stop to the infighting and things for the most part, the men don't really have to do that anymore, but the women still do all the stuff that they've always historically done. So basically, no disrespect intended, but the dudes just sit around all day smoking their traded tobacco, shooting the shit in the ewe, which always is closest to the river and faces the river so they can see any enemy approaching, but ain't no enemies approaching anymore, right? So they just chill in the ewe, smoking tobacco. Yeah, they're probably carving wood and stuff, but not all of them do. And just talking and hanging out. Like I said, pool table, foosball table, if they had them, that's where they'd be. And they'd be playing with them all day long. So when Michael Rockefeller arrived in Asmat territory, there had been a few white men who had settled nearby, missionaries, people who wanted to study the Asmat, to learn more about them. And thus far, these very few individuals had been treated fine by the Asmat and, pretty much welcomed and accepted. But that's mainly because the Asmat didn't really know what to make of the white man initially. They didn't know what these people were, like who they were. The white men could be spirits, they could be gods, they could be ghosts, they could be anything, but whatever they were, the Asmat were not about to attack them or push their luck because they knew that no death would go unavenged. And since they didn't really know what they were dealing with these new humans, they couldn't be sure how that retribution would come. As I said, in the 60s, when Michael arrived, the Asmat were still practicing their beliefs, but it was sort of an unspoken understanding between the outsiders, like the Dutch government and the missionaries, that as long as they didn't see it with their own eyes, as long as they didn't see the Asmat just strolling around in the open, cutting off people's heads, doing these ceremonies with skulls, etc., everyone would sort of pretend it wasn't happening. Don't make waves. Don't, have all of this violence happening to the point where the government at higher levels is getting involved, and we cool. In his journal, Michael Rockefeller wrote, quote, "The Asmat is a land of great winding rivers, tropical forests, and mud, literally nothing else. The people have for centuries lived on little besides the pulp of the sago palm and fish. There are no minerals, and not a single cash crop will grow successfully," end quote. So if you remember when we talked about the Dani people in the Belgium Valley, they raised pigs, they grew sweet potatoes, but because of the area where the Asmat people had settled thousands and thousands of years years ago, which was very wet, always getting flooded, they basically didn't have the ability to grow sweet potatoes and things like that. Later, after his first expedition, Michael would say he was sad to see that despite their isolated location, the Asmat had been touched by the Western world. And he said, quote, "Many of the villages have reached that point where they are beginning to doubt the worth of their own culture and crave things Western. There is everywhere a depressing respect for the white man's shirt and pants, no matter how tattered and dirty," end quote. So what he's talking about is when these explorers or missionaries or things would come in, the Asmat people would be like, "Oh, wow, cool. Like, look at your clothes." Because, the Asmat, like the Dani people would, be pretty much naked for the most part. They didn't need anything else. And it's super, super hot there, right? Like super hot, muggy. It's wet. Like you don't really need all those clothes there. And as long as they felt that they were cool with walking around naked, YouTube doesn't feel like they're okay with walking around naked, but as long as the Asmat felt like they were okay, that's how it should have continued. But then the white men come, they're wearing clothes, and the Asmat are like, "Oh, we want clothes," and they'd start trading for those clothes, and then people would kind of go into these Asmat villages and see these native people wearing like shorts and shirts and stuff, and Michael was annoyed by this, I guess. Like he felt it was sort of like cheapening their culture. However, Michael would still use this craving for Western things to achieve his own goals. And this first expedition into Asmat territory was basically to see what they had that he wanted and what they would want in return for what he needed and wanted from them. So Michael met a priest named Cornelius Van Kessel, and Van Kessel was introduced to Michael as the first white man to explore the southern Asmat area. And this is a much more isolated area than like the northern Asmat area. And Van Kessel is going to be very important to this story, so remember his name. Now, Michael would write to a friend about Van Kessel, saying, quote, "For several reasons, I think he is going to prove my most valuable contact, and he appears willing to help me in my collecting for the Museum of Primitive Art. He could be particularly valuable because he has the confidence of the natives in the area and therefore probably has greater access to the good pieces than I ever would," end quote. And it was true, right? Van Kessel did have the trust of the Asmat. He knew how to speak their language. He understood their traditions and their beliefs. He traveled by canoe, as they did, and he adorned himself with feathers and ochre and ash, as they did. I have one picture of Van Kessel that I'll try to put into the video if the quality's good enough, but it's super, super tiny, but it shows him basically dressed as an Asmat man. And Van Kessel had actually replaced our boy Zegward when he'd moved on in 1955. So remember, Zegward was like the first man to live with the Asmat people, and he gave us the stories about their rituals and things that he'd gotten from an elder. So Van Kessel replaced him as the missionary in that area, and he was posted in the southern Asmat village of Atch, which was known to be one of the most powerful and violent of Asmat villages. This was a man who had truly integrated himself, and this caused him to be loved and accepted by the Asmat people. But he was also kind of looked at with suspicion by his own kind, like the church and the government, because they were like, "Yo, why are you so like tight with these people? You're here for a reason. Like you're supposed to be assimilating them to like what we want. You're not supposed to be assimilating into them." And you will see this dude gets ripped apart and attacked when he tries to come forward and say what he believed happened to Michael after Michael disappeared. So Michael Rockefeller and his anthropologist guide, Renee Wassing, chatted with Van Kessel for a bit, and then they continued on, spending the night in the home of a Dutch government official before boarding a canoe the next morning and rowing all day and all night until arriving in the village of Amanamake, where Adrian Gerbrands was staying, along with an American anthropologist from Yale named David Ide, whose dissertation had been about headhunting and warfare amongst the natives. On this day, the Asmat of the village were having a celebration, and Michael was excited to watch while taking pictures. The next day, Michael took some more pictures and paid some men in the village to reenact what an attack would look like, basically, attack amongst warring peoples. poles, and he most likely paid them in tobacco or stone axes or something like that in order for them to reenact this. They weren't just going to do it because he asked. After this, Michael and Renee moved on, going upriver where there were more villages, and as he went, Michael collected Asmat items that he would then bring back to the museum. But what caught his eye more than any other Asmat items were their ceremonial beige poles, also known as ancestor poles. Now, these poles are huge. They can be anywhere from 15 to 20 feet high. They're carved from a fully grown mangrove tree. These are very, very, very important to the Asmat. If a group of Asmat men are walking through the forest and they see a big, tall mangrove tree, they attack it as if they were attacking a man while on a headhunting mission. Adrian Gerbrands says, quote, "When it is cut down and the bark removed, its bare wood is soon covered with beads of red sap that look like blood. The red sap produced by the killed mangrove undoubtedly accounts for the choice of this tree to symbolize the ancestor," end quote. The trees are then brought back into the village with great ceremony, and a master carver gets to work while the relatives of the dead who will occupy the pole provide the carver with food. The ancestor poles hold the souls of the dead, and they also serve as a pledge, a promise that the soul will be avenged. And the poles are truly beautiful works of art, hand-carved, each one different from the other, and they take at least 2 weeks to finish, some longer. They're carved and erected after a member of the community has been killed by a headhunter, because as we spoke about before, they believed that the spirit of the dead would linger and cause sickness and bad luck. So the poles were intended to protect the village and the people and to also satisfy the spirits, basically saying to them, "Don't worry, fam, we got you. You can go ahead and cross the sea to Saffin. Don't hang here and cause us problems. We will avenge you." So, needless to say, these poles are super important to the Asmat people. They meant something. They meant a lot of things, and Michael wanted them badly for the museum, writing, quote, "This was one kind of object that seemed to inviolate for the encroachment of Western commercialism upon Asmat art. I quickly decided to buy one," end quote. All right, so dude was a Harvard-educated man. You know, he had to show it when he spoke. And what he meant with all of those words, those big words that he used for no reason, was he felt that these poles, these beige poles, ancestor poles, were the one item that was free from the intrusion of the West. And then directly after saying that, he's like, I need to have them. I need to buy them immediately. He's scoffing at Western commercialism and how it cheapens the art of the Asmat and the meaning behind the art and their culture and their society. But then he clearly doesn't understand the deep meaning, and he takes part in this Western commercialism, this encroachment, if you will, because it's okay if he does it. He wants to put it in a museum. He's not doing it for money, but there's going to be an admission charge to get into that museum and see these beautiful and rare ancestor poles of the Asmat that nobody in the States had in their museum, right? People can really convince themselves of anything. They can justify anything if they want to. And here's another thing, right? As I was going through old newspaper articles about Michael, I stumbled upon a quote from a Dr. J. Bodenmaker, who at the time was the deputy governor of Dutch New Guinea. Now, Bodenmaker claimed that he'd gotten to know Michael well during the summer of 1961, and Michael, quote, was going after headhunter relics along the coast of Asmat territory. Michael wanted to buy carved ships, totem poles, and human heads from the local population, end quote. First of all, they're not totem poles. They're beige poles, they're ancestor poles. They're not totem poles. Second of all, when he says ships, he means canoes. And I do want to say that nowhere in Michael's own writings, at least those that are published, does he mention going after human heads? Because when the Asmat do their head hunting and they bring a head back, the head becomes very important. They keep it. Sometimes they use it as like a pillow, or they'll mount it in their home. Like it's very important. So nowhere in his writings did I hear him say or read. I didn't hear. He wasn't talking to me. Did I read him saying that he wanted like human heads? But like I said, I can only read what has been released to the general public, which obviously was vetted before it was released. Additionally, this is the deputy governor speaking after Michael went missing, and he told the media that Michael's presence in the area had stimulated local trade, especially in the human head market. And just a few weeks before Michael would go missing, Bodenmaker claimed a local administrator in Asmat had been approached by some Asmat people, and he was asked for permission to go headhunting for one evening only. Bodenmaker goes on to say, quote, "It was because Michael had been offering 10 steel hatchets for one head. We had to warn him off as he was creating a demand which could not be met without bloodshed," end quote. Okay, so what Bodenmaker is saying here is like, the Asmat people were not headhunting at this time in 1961. They just weren't doing it at all. And then Michael came and he was trying to buy what relics they had from their history of headhunting. And he was offering stuff that they really wanted, right? Tobacco, stone axes, stuff like that. And so the Asmat people were like, oh, we need more heads to sell to this kid. So let's ask the government for permission to go headhunting one night. And we'll get as many heads as we can so that we can get all the stuff that we want. That's what Bodenmaker is saying. And he claims he told Michael, like, listen, kid, you got to, put a hold on this because you're causing this supply-demand issue that's basically going to result in a ton of human life being lost. Now, is this true, what Bodenmaker said? I mean, it's certainly true that he said it because I read it in the paper. But was it true? Did this actually happen? Or was it a carefully calculated political statement made in the wake of what could have been viewed as either a disaster or an opportunity by the Dutch government in New Guinea? After all, it's been said that politicians rarely let a good crisis go to waste. We're going to talk about this more later, but this is going to be a constant question as we go through this. Who's telling the truth? What do they have to gain? What do they have to lose? Because there was a lot more going on in this time and in this place than Michael just trying to get some cool stuff for a museum. So Michael and his crew, which is basically just Renee and Adrian, who was there in that village at that point, they come upon 4 of these poles. And Adrian Gerbrands is like, you don't want just one pole, okay? You want all 4. Because, like, one pole is cool and everything, but to have a complete ceremonial set, that would be a once-in-a-lifetime get for the museum. So Michael decided to buy all 4 poles. But not only that, he also paid the villagers to perform a ceremony with the poles so that he could watch and record it. Now, I don't know if he realized how insulting this was. He most likely didn't. I don't think that he was intentionally a rude or disrespectful person. He was young, he was impetuous, and he was also shielded, I think, at home in New York by his family, where he was pretty much used to getting his way, and nobody ever told him, like, you're rude or disrespectful to our culture. Because, to be honest, like, he really hadn't been around a ton of different cultures before, right? He did some traveling in his youth, but not like this. So I don't think he realized how condescending it was. He's like, dance for me, natives. Use your special poles to do something special right now. Dance for me. How can you demand that people perform their sacred ceremonies for you just because you're there at that point and you happen to want to see it and record it? Like, there's certain preparations that need to be made. There's certain times of the day or year that these things happen. They happen for a reason, right? They're prompted by something. They follow or precede something. And the reason for these beige poles is to keep the soul of a headhunting victim at bay, to send a signal to him that his death will be avenged. Now, it's very likely that the Asmat were like, yo, take this kid's tobacco, sing a little song, do a little dance, get down tonight so he can be on his way. Michael Rockefeller may have been ignorant to a lot of things, even though he used a lot of big words in one sentence, He may have still been ignorant about certain sensitivities, certain cultures, things like that. But he knew when he was being had. And after this ceremony that he paid them to put on, he wrote in his journal, quote, "There is no magic involved and no offering or religious attention paid to the poles as such. This fact probably accounts for the ease with which the Asmat were induced to reenact the ceremony. Where there is no danger of angering a god or misapplying magic, such an occasion must be welcomed by the village," end quote. No shit, Sherlock. So what he's saying is, like, they did it too easily, and it didn't seem like these polls actually meant anything to them. And he was disappointed by it, right? He had the balls to write that he was disappointed by it in his journal, which is fine. Like I said, I don't think he meant harm. Like, there's a fine line between good intentions and bad intentions. There's a fine line between ignorance and audacity. I'm trying to really balance in between his ignorance and his audacity, and I'm trying to find this middle ground where he just didn't know better because he's not around to tell me whether he did or not. Now, the fact of the matter is these 4 polls that Michael got, they actually didn't mean much to the ASMAT people at this time, and that's why they were willing to sell them. So when a death is avenged, the soul can now vacate, and it's no longer attached to that ancestral pole. So the pole still stands. And yeah, I guess it's like a reminder of the person, but it doesn't have any like magical or spiritual meaning any longer now that that death has been avenged. And these 4 poles were sort of like in the middle of the forest. They were old, they weren't close to the village, and the deaths of the people that they had been built for had been avenged. So they weren't super important at that point, and the people were willing to sell them. However, Michael became obsessed with these beige poles, and every time he saw one, he wanted to buy one. Carl Hoffman, the author of the book Savage Harvest, writes, quote, "He had no understanding that by trading in beige poles, he was trading in the souls of men, souls that could make you sick, souls that could kill you. Michael was working with a bottomless supply of money, the one thing that limits most people, that checks them, that focuses them to use friendship and reciprocity and patience with others. And there's a profound difference between people who are your friends and people who want your money," end quote. Now, Hoffman doesn't mean money in this sense because the ASMAT people would have no use for traditional money as we know it. But the things that Michael was able to buy with his money, tobacco and stone axes and things like that, things that he would trade to the ASMAT, that is what Hoffman means when he speaks about money in this context. And Hoffman theorizes that Michael was less interested in building relationships with the ASMAT and more interested in collecting their artwork and artifacts and such. And I do agree with that to some extent, but I don't think it was necessarily an aversion for Michael to building relationships. I don't think he was like, "Ugh, I don't want anything to do with these people. I just want their art." I think for him, especially at this first trip, there was a time constraint, to build the kind of relationship that someone like Father Van Kessel had with the ASMAT. It takes years. I mean, it takes learning a new and complicated language, immersing yourself in that culture to build that trust and understanding. And Michael may have had the desire to do this, like eventually, but he was on a schedule at this point, which included getting back to the documentary team and then showing his father what he had collected so he could prove he'd been doing something productive in those months. And maybe, just maybe, he would be allowed to come back for a second expedition and a third expedition and a fourth where he could take more time. Maybe he'd even live there for years, just like the missionaries did. And we also need to look at it from the perspective of the ASMAT people, though, right? How completely unnerving it would be to have these strange-looking people wearing clothes you'd never seen before, carrying cameras which you'd never seen before, just doing things and speaking a language that you didn't understand. Like, how crazy that would be for them. The further Michael and his crew went up the river, like closer to the sea, the more uncontacted the people were, and most of them had never even seen a white man, much less cameras and rolls of film and beers and things like that. Beer like you drink. For a people who were so entrenched in beliefs of magic and spirits, it must have really and truly been a strange experience, even an unsettling one. And it may have challenged everything these people had known or believed for their entire lives. I mean, imagine, right? You're just chilling in your backyard after work, you're having a glass of wine, drinking a beer, watching the kids play, and suddenly a bunch of purple people walk up. And they don't speak any language you've ever heard of. They make beeping sounds with their mouths. And they have all this equipment with flashing lights and stuff, equipment you've never seen. They're nice enough, I guess, right? But they want you to sit down to dinner with your family so they can watch you and take pictures of you. And they want to follow you to work so they can videotape you in your office. And they want to be there on Christmas morning so they can watch you sing carols and open presents. It's crazy to think about. It would throw even the most tinfoil hat wearing person for a loop, even in 2022. Where, let's be honest, nothing surprises us anymore. I don't know how surprised I would be if purple people walked into my yard and wanted to record me having dinner with my family. I'd be annoyed, but I wouldn't necessarily be stunned. But at the same time, right, people in like the Western world in 2022 are not the Asmat people in the 1960s, which it might have well been like the 1800s, because they hadn't changed anything about the way they lived and what they had done in so many years. And then suddenly this hits you. I mean, at least us now, like, we have these theories about aliens. So if aliens came to the planet, we'd be like, yeah, we kind of were expecting this. Like, we didn't know it was going to take this long, but here you are. We've been waiting for you. What's up? But the Asmat people, man, this would have been shocking, unsettling. They may have been asking, like, who sent these people? What do they want? Why are they here? And then Michael arrived in the village of Ots-Janep, a very important area for our story. Here, Michael saw 7 more beige poles, 7 poles connected to the souls of 7 murdered men whose deaths had not yet been avenged. The 4 poles he'd already purchased, yeah, they were beautiful, they were important at one time, but the deaths of those men had already been avenged. These ones had not. And the number of poles is important here as well, because in 1958, just a couple of years before Michael strolled into this village, something had happened in that village that Michael and his guides had not been made aware of. On February 8th, 1958, another white man had arrived in Ots-Janep, but this one arrived in a boat owned by the Danish government, accompanied by 11 Papuan law enforcement officials dressed in military-style uniforms and armed with assault weapons. At this time, like I said, Indonesia was split in 2, with Australia owning one half and the Dutch owning the other half. Now, this man was Max Lepre. He was the new government controller for the Dutch, and he'd been notified about constant fighting and violence between the Asmat villages of Ots-Janep and Oomestep. And this violence had apparently been spiraling out of control. The month prior, Max had sent some men to Oomestep to put a stop to it, and at that time, they'd made 11 arrests. They'd also burned some canoes, and they had confiscated spears and handmade knives. But as it turned out, Oomestep's rival village, Ots-Janep, they weren't happy about the government interference in a war that they considered theirs to rightfully engage in. And word was sent back with the police to the government that the people in these villages would have no further interference. And if there was, they would be willing to use violence if they had to. So Max decided, if you want something done right, if you want to show the people who's boss, you got to do it yourself. But Max Lepre may not have been the best person to be a peacemaker, because he may have had some biases, and there may not have been a whole lot of peace in his own heart towards the native peoples of Indonesia. So, of course, we have to talk about Max Lepre now, and who he was and what his deal was. Max Lepre had been born on the island of Sumatra in 1925. Now, Sumatra is the second largest of the 4 Greater Sunda Islands, the biggest island being Borneo. Just to insert here, it's actually a very interesting area, geographically, historically, and culturally. For instance, and for a fun fact, the smallest of the Greater Sunda Islands is Java. It's about the size of New York State, yet roughly 60 to 65% of Indonesia's population live there. It's about 130 million people, whereas Sumatra, which is much larger than Java, holds less than a third of Indonesia's population. Super interesting. But anyways, I digress, because I could actually talk about this area for hours, and I don't want to scare you with how interested I am in it. All right, so Max Lepre, he's a little Dutch boy born on this Indonesian island. His father was a soldier in the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, which was the military force maintained by the Netherlands to service its colony in the Dutch East Indies, which really meant to keep control and crush anyone who stands against their colonial rule. Because, the indigenous people of this area, they didn't stand on the shores and cheer as their oppressors rolled up, right? They didn't really want them to be there, and they'd fought back against them being there for basically hundreds of years, whether it was the Dutch or the French or the English. They didn't want them there. Now, when Max was 3, he and his family moved to the island of Sulawesi, also part of the 4 Greater Sunda Islands, and the family lived in an area on the island populated completely by other Dutch colonists. But it was also an area that would soon be filled with great unrest. In 1928, people in Indonesia who had previously not really shared a common identity as Indonesians began to come together in what we now call the Indonesia National Awakening. And this would plant the seed for Indonesia eventually proclaiming their independence in 1945. Now, it was the first time that the people developed a national consciousness, and native voices that had long been suppressed by the Dutch joined together because, let's be honest, when it came to strength in numbers, the indigenous people had the numbers. They spoke out against colonial rule, and they began to develop their own political ideas, and obviously, that scared the shit out of the Dutch. So Max would have grown up seeing this sort of culminating and coming to a head. He would have heard his father and the other soldiers talking about how they had to handle the population in order to prevent them from organizing and rising up. Now, fast forward to the year 1942, when Japan invaded the British stronghold of Singapore, forcing the British to withdraw, and as a result, opening the Dutch East Indies to Japanese occupation. The Dutch would not have wanted this, right? Because Japan was not messing around at this point. Honestly, I don't think Japan's ever messing around. They go ham, man, okay? And this is also a very interesting piece of history. And if you want to know more, I highly suggest you check out Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. He did an extensive series called Supernova in the East, and it does cover this period of history known as the Asia-Pacific War. I wish we could talk about it more. I really do. But anyways, the Dutch didn't want Japan there, so Max's father was sent to the front to try and hold them off, at which point he was taken prisoner, leaving his family alone on an island that at this point was basically in a state of emergency because they were about to be invaded and it was absolute chaos. As Japan moved into the Greater Sunda Islands, Dutch schools were closed, Dutch women and children were being sent back home in huge numbers, and those left behind were taken prisoner and placed into work camps, and that was the fate of Max Lepre. He was eventually released from the work camps after World War II ended, but now he was faced with a whole new set of problems because the Indonesian people, they viewed Japan as their liberators, the people who had driven the Dutch back, and this was leaving a space for the indigenous people to decide how they were going to move forward and what kind of country they would create. Now, Japan basically fostered this a lot for their own political advantage because they wanted to gain military support from the Indonesian people during World War II, and so they had trained young men to fight. But I will say, when Japan was defeated in the Second World War and the Dutch tried to move back in, this new army made up of previously untrained Indonesian soldiers, they fought back against the Dutch coming back in. And you know what? Some Japanese soldiers, they chose to stay and fight side by side with them instead of retreating and fleeing. About 3,000 soldiers did that, even though they didn't have to. They could have retreated. Instead, they stayed and they fought, and 1/3 of them died fighting for the independence of another country. Anyways, needless to say, if you were Dutch and you were in Indonesia at that time, you were not anyone's favorite person. And the people who lived in Indonesia, they made this clear by claiming the property and the belongings of Dutch colonists. They would hit them with stones and beat them with sticks in the streets, and eventually they began taking them prisoner at gunpoint. Now, Max was taken prisoner in Malang, where he and his fellow colonists were beaten and demoralized. And you know what? Maybe this didn't leave the best taste in his mouth. So when Max was released in 1946, he went back to the Netherlands, but he would return a decade later to the small area of Indonesia still owned by the Dutch, and that was Papua New Guinea. And this time it was he who was brandishing the guns and holding what he believed to be the power and the upper hand. And that brings us back to February of 1958. And Max Lepre has information that these two Asmat villages are fighting, and they're taking each other's heads, and it's never going to end because they have to avenge each death, and more people are dying, and it's this terrible cycle that he just can't allow to happen, not on his watch. So Max went to the village of Omestep, and he found that it was empty. Maybe they'd heard he was coming, and they took off into the jungle to wait it out. Maybe it was just that this part of the village was flooded, so they retreated further inland, which they often did at times of high tide. But he did not like that the village was empty. You know, he didn't know why it was, but he didn't like it. And he thought, well, I'm here anyways. Might as well send a message. So he lit their U on fire, the U, or the bachelor house, one of the most important structures in Asmat culture, the center of their social and spiritual life. But that wasn't a strong enough message, so he lit their canoes on fire. The canoe, the way the Asmat people travel, the vessel that allows them to get from place to place so that they can hunt and gather and fish. And then in a baffling and stunning display of toxic masculinity, Max Lepre stood on the banks of the river and shot several rounds from his machine gun into the air, like Rambo. He was annoyed that the people were evading his intervention, so he called in reinforcements from the Dutch outposts, and he recruited the Atch village, the Asmat village called Atch. And the Atch village were known enemies of the village of Oostgenaep. So together, they all rolled up into the village of Oostgenaep, but apparently those villagers had already gotten word that Max was coming, and they were ready to fight. Unfortunately, the Asmat spears were no match for Max and his soldiers and his machine guns, and a fight ensued. Most of the villagers, once they realized what was going on and that it was hopeless, they ran into the jungle to hide and retreat. But several Asmat men were brutally killed. And when that was all done, Max Lepre set their canoes on fire as well. And then he and his men left. He would later claim that he was attacked because the villagers were mad at him because they didn't want to let go of their headhunting practices. Max said, quote, "It is highly likely that the people now understand that they would do better not to resist authorities," end quote. And I want to be fair. I can see this from both angles. Max and his peeps rolling up the river, they were attacked. But they were attacked because the village of Oostgenaep was on the defensive because they didn't want them interfering. And to be honest, I understand why you wouldn't want them killing each other and chopping off each other's heads. I get it. But at the same time, no one asked you to be there. No one asked you to be in New Guinea. These people didn't ask y'all to come in and just put your name on the land and take over. So I see where, depending on how you're raised, what you believe in, what you think is right and what is wrong, where you could see both sides as being wrong, but no one asked you to be there, Max. A year after Max Lepre's raid on Oostgenaep, 7 beige poles were erected to honor the men who had been killed by his machine guns. 7 souls whose deaths had not yet been avenged by the time Michael Rockefeller strolled into their village. Another white man who maybe the people of the village were like, we didn't ask you to be here either. And he had the audacity to try and purchase these 7 beige poles. Now, what you need to understand is that even though all deaths must be avenged, there's no time limit for this. And it can happen whenever. It can happen a week later, a month later, a year later, a decade later. But it has to happen. And the Asmat, they didn't necessarily strike directly after an attack. Sometimes they would wait for the proper moment. Sometimes they would wait for years. When your entire life revolves around a few very important beliefs, you can have a very long and very clear memory. In fact, one of the men from the Asmat village of Atch, who had joined Max Lepre's raid on the village of Oostgenaep, he was later invited to their village, Oostgenaep, and they told him he was their guest for a great feast, but he was murdered, and he became the feast himself. And this happened the month after Michael Rockefeller left Asmat territory in 1961, 3 years after the raid had happened in 1958. So they'll wait, man. They'll bide their time. They're not going to tell you when or where, but they will get you. Now, the thing about these beige poles, these 7 ones that he wanted to purchase in Oostgenaep, they said okay, and they took his bartered goods and they were like, we'll deliver them to you at the river later. But by the time he was heading back to the documentary crew, back to the Bellium Valley, the poles hadn't gotten there yet. And he was like, oh, I'm sure they'll be here when I come in a couple of months. They weren't there. So the people didn't deliver them. They took his stuff, but they didn't deliver the poles to the river. And that could have been and should have been a sign to him that they weren't super eager to sell them or trade them. But Michael Rockefeller returned to the documentary crew in July, writing to a friend that his first trip to Asmat had been a success and that he had managed to procure several items that he was sure would find special places in his father's museum. In his journal, he wrote that the Asmat trip was, quote, equal to most of my wildest dreams, end quote. He planned to return to Asmat and collect more poles and more artifacts, and he wrote to Father Van Kessel in order to let him know about his intention to return, telling the priest that he had a special interest in the village of Oostjanep. Now, like I said, the reason for this was because Michael had made arrangements to buy those 7 poles while he'd been there. And, he thought that they had just been slow in delivering the poles to the river. So he was like, I'm going to come back and I'll get them then. Now, as the filming of Dead Birds, the documentary, wrapped up in August, Michael got word from home about a huge scandal that revolved around his family that the public would not be made aware of for several more months. Michael's father, Nelson Rockefeller, was leaving his wife of over 30 years, and he was leaving her for his campaign aide, a woman named Margaretta Murphy, who was a married mother of 4 and 18 years younger than the illustrious New York governor. Michael was sent a letter. He got word that something was about to go down. And so after 6 months of basically living outside the bounds of everything he had known all his life, Michael flew back to New York, and he quickly visited with his family, met up with some friends. He checked in with his mother to make sure she was doing okay, and then he flew right back to New Guinea. He did not want to get too comfortable with, electricity and soft beds and rich foods. He had a mission and a plan, and he could not be distracted from that. He returned to Indonesia in September of 1961, and he wrote in his journal, quote, "What time is it, and where am I? It is nighttime, with the crickets going berserk all around me, and I'm back in Hollandia. I arrived exhausted today and found that tomorrow at 8:40 a.m., Renee and I will fly back to Morocco in order to make a 6 p.m. boat to Asmat. I am now surrounded by my little reality for the next 10 weeks, a chaos of cameras and recording equipment cluttering up everything, including my mind. The key to my fascination with the Asmat is the wood carving. The sculpture which the people here produce is some of the most extraordinary in the primitive world. And equally as remarkable as the art is the fact that the culture which produces it is still intact. Some remote areas are still headhunting, and only 5 years ago, the whole area was headhunting." End quote. So even though, like I said, the Dutch government, the Netherlands government, was saying, no one's headhunting in this area, Michael himself, who had been there and he had been in some of these remote areas, he was like, yeah, they still are in some of these places. They still are. Michael was hoping that if he succeeded in this mission, if he was able to bring back certain pieces that were valuable to his father and to the museum, if he was able to truly understand these cultures, maybe he could continue to travel and take pictures and procure pieces of these cultures. He wouldn't have to become a businessman or a politician. He could, for the rest of his life, do this thing that he loved, that made him feel alive, travel and be, exposed to other cultures and be basically a spectator of history. He was expected to contribute to his family and its legacy, but maybe he could be of service to the Rockefellers in this way. From Hollandia, he traveled to Morocco, 150 miles southwest from Asmat, where the Dutch had a police post, and he immediately left there for Agats, which was considered to be in Asmat territory. And this had been the first boat in 2 months to leave Morocco for Agats, so Michael and Renee had to hustle because they didn't know when the next one was going to come. Now, once in Agats, he slept in what he called a shed on stilts with no light, no furniture, and no running water. And he complains in his journal about the Papuan houseboy who was supposed to bring firewood every morning, but he only made an appearance on the first day, and then he disappeared into the jungle. But Michael also seemed to be falling under the spell of this simple way of living, far from the hustle and bustle of what he had always known, writing, quote, "Nights here are really the most fun. Something like the teeth grinding in the ballium, a rhythm created by the patter of mice feet over the walls and ceiling with crickets chirping and frogs burping in counterpoint. The roosters here are affected by a curious neurosis which causes them to begin crowing at midnight. Last night we had an earthquake to rock us to sleep." End quote. But Michael couldn't stay in one place. He had to go deeper into Asmat territory, and to do that, he would need a boat that was big enough to store all of his equipment in and all the items that he'd purchased or was going to purchase. First, there were the items that he would buy specifically to use for bartering, things like tobacco, fishing line, cloth, and stone axes. And he bought a bunch of this stuff, and he spent $7,000 on these things. That's over 50,000 modern dollars. He did not, however, purchase a radio for his travels, a radio that may have connected him to the outside world should he have needed this connection, which it turns out he greatly did. And of course, there needed to be room in the boat for all the Asmat art pieces that he would collect as he went. By chance, Michael happened to meet a Dutch patrol officer named Wim van de Wal, who will also become important to this story. And van de Wal had built this catamaran-like boat, which was large enough to hold all that Michael had and all he hoped to gain. It was created with 2 Asmat canoes tied together with like a small thatched roof over a cabin-like area, and Michael purchased the catamaran from Van de Wal, and on October 6th, he wrote, quote, "At this point, I really have no idea what our trip will be like or how successful it will be. One moment I'm depressed, the next I'm filled with excitement. The reports about the areas we are going to and the extent of acculturation are so conflicting that one really has no idea what to expect. We are equipped with good camera and sound recording equipment, an Asmat interpreter, and plenty of barter goods, so that I hope we will make the most of what we come up with." End quote. So what does the word acculturation mean? It sort of means assimilation, right? So Michael was not sure how much the people he was going to visit had assimilated into modern Western ways, as many people in like a GATS had. So like the closer you were to the main hub where the Dutch were, even if you were Asmat, you would be more westernized. You would see more men wearing shorts and shirts and stuff and smoking tobacco. And then the further downriver you got, like up towards the ocean or the sea, the less sort of assimilated people would be. Acculturation, more than assimilation, however, usually refers to a minority population, and I suppose, in a way, these tribes that populated Papua New Guinea, who still lived in very much prehistoric ways, they were considered the minority, although I'm sure they didn't feel that way, because out there in the jungles and the forests, Michael was the minority. On October 7th, 1961, Michael wrote to Father Van Kessel. And if you remember, Father Van Kessel was living in Asmat territory, and this was the last correspondence that the priest would ever receive from the young Rockefeller. Michael told Van Kessel of his plans to explore the coast, stopping at Asmat villages along the way, and he hoped that Van Kessel could give him the names of a few villages where he and Renee could visit and even stay for a week or two. He signed off telling Van Kessel that he looked forward to seeing him in November, but this meeting was never going to happen. Michael left Agats on October 10th, accompanied by Renee Wassing and a teenage boy from an Asmat village named Simon, who was meant to be their interpreter not only to the Asmat language, but to their customs and culture. And the first village they arrived at was Pur, the home of a very talented woodcarver who at that time was working on a beautiful canoe prow. And of course, Michael wanted to buy it, right? The woodcarver said, this particular piece, it's not for sale, but he did agree to carve for Michael an entire canoe that Michael could pick up later that month. In Michael's mind, this second trip to Asmat was already going swimmingly. An entire canoe was a huge win, and he was more sure of his success when he arrived in the next village of Anamanake, where he had previously been introduced to Dr. Adrian Gerbrands and the anthropologist from Yale, David Ide. And remember, this is where Michael bought his first 4 ancestor poles. On October 25th, Michael wrote that when they arrived in the village at 8 a.m., it was low tide and too shallow for them to sail into the tributary whose banks the village was built on. So Simon, their teenage interpreter, he had to shout into the air to signal to the villagers that they needed to help. Michael wrote, quote, "There was a hollow chant-like answer in the distance. Then we could hear the slap, slap of paddles in the water. First, the chief, who had been with us on our previous canoe trip, arrived. He was wild with excitement at our return. More canoes arrived, and then men jumped into the water and mud about our catamaran in order to pull it up the tributary to the village. The Asmat had a special shout, which is chanted at once by many men and used as a form of welcome. All the village lined the riverbank, and we heard this again and again as we made slow progress upstream." End quote. Maybe Michael felt that this was how he would be greeted as he arrived at all Asmat villages. After all, as far as he was concerned, he wasn't a threat, and he'd done nothing wrong to anger or offend anyone when he had been in this area just a few months prior. By the time Michael and Renee had returned to Agat's in November, he had collected hundreds of items, taken thousands of pictures, and been the recipient of warm welcomes from all 13 of the Asmat villages he had visited. Michael got his new treasures cataloged and ready to ship back to the Museum of Primitive Arts in New York City, and as he did this, he was buzzing with excitement and possibilities and new ideas. Michael felt that he was truly beginning to understand this culture and its people, even though he had only spent, cumulatively, between both journeys, roughly 2 months in their midst, and not ever in the same village. But maybe he did comprehend how limited his understanding was, how much more there was to learn, because he wrote, quote, "The Asmat is like a huge puzzle, with variations in ceremony and art style forming the pieces. My trips are enabling me to comprehend, if only in a superficial, rudimentary manner, the nature of this puzzle." End quote. Michael wrote that he felt that he would be able to organize what he called a mammoth exhibit, which would do justice to the art of the Asmat people, saying, quote, "Nothing approaching this has ever been granted to a single primitive people. You can imagine what fun I am having, dreaming these wild dreams and creating earth-shattering hypotheses about the nature of Asmat art." End quote. Like, what is he forming hypotheses about their art and the nature of it? Like, why didn't he just ask them what it meant, you know? Like, they know what it means. You don't need to, like, hypothesize what it means. Like, they know, because what it means to them is the only real meaning. But while Michael was getting excited about all that could be, there were others who were more concerned about what already was. Now remember, Indonesia had gained their freedom and independence, technically, but New Guinea was still occupied by the Netherlands and Australia. And for the most part, the United States had maintained a position of neutrality in this dispute, specifically during the Eisenhower administration. But like, who am I kidding, man? They always say, we, the U.S., they're always like, we're neutral on this, but behind the scenes, they are not, right? And that was the case here. Basically, Indonesia said, we want all these people out. But the fear was, as was pretty, run-of-the-mill during this time, the fear was communism. Communism was spreading through Southeast Asia. And everyone was worried, especially the U.S., that an economically fragile Indonesia would also turn to communism, which would then spread to New Guinea, which was just around the corner from Australia. So it's like, communism, we don't want it to come to the Western world. That was a very big thing during this time. It's a very complicated situation, and believe me, I am boiling it down to the barest of bare bones. But essentially, when JFK took office, he had to find a solution to this problem. He could not continue the policy of neutrality because both Indonesia and the Netherlands had refused to negotiate with each other. And there was a growing threat of, Indonesia mounting like a military operation against West New Guinea and the Dutch there. Now, the Dutch kind of wanted to get out of there anyways, but they didn't want it to look like they were being chased off or that they were weak. So first, what they wanted to do was install an internal Indonesian government made up of native peoples who had been hand-chosen by the Dutch, and they would be considered elite. So that when the Dutch finally pulled out, these elites, who were technically Indonesian but had been groomed and trained by, the Netherlands, these elites would already have created a government that was friendly towards the West, friendly towards Danish business interests, and not super friendly towards communism. Now, in the Kennedy administration, there were opposing viewpoints as to how the United States should proceed. National Security Advisor Walt Resto pretty much said the U.S. needed to take advantage of its NATO alliance with the Netherlands and tell them to get out of New Guinea, because if they didn't, the president of Indonesia, President Sukarno, he would turn to the Soviet Union for help and all would be lost. And in fact, at this time, Sukarno was purchasing hundreds of millions of dollars of weapons from the Soviets, making his threat to take New Guinea back by force a real one, to be taken seriously. So they were saying, give New Guinea to Indonesia, make them happy, keep them from having to ally with the Soviets. But the Netherlands, Great Britain, and Australia were like, nah, that doesn't really align with what we want to do. It doesn't align with our business interests. And honestly, it doesn't look great for us on the world stage. It'll look like we're caving to Indonesia. We can't do that. So basically, the U.S. felt it couldn't wait for the Dutch to set up their friendly government because that would take at least a decade. And it didn't seem like President Sukarno was going to remain patient for that long, at all. So all of these talks and debates were happening in 1961, the same year Michael was freewheeling around Asmat territory. The Dutch foreign prime minister, Joseph Luns, he was traveling to Washington to engage in talks to retain the colony. President Sukarno was also traveling to the White House to make his argument. And none of this would have been important to Michael or the Asmat people because they didn't even know that it was happening. But it would become important later. Michael arrived in Agats on November 15th after his 15-day trip to the northwest corner of the Asmat. There he had tea with a group of missionaries, including the infamous Father Zegwaard, our dude, who gave us so much information about Asmat beliefs and rituals, as well as another priest named Hubertus von Piege, who was stationed in the village of Atch, but who once a month he would go to Agats to swap stories with the other missionaries. So Michael told the others that it was his intention to leave early the following Friday to head south into more isolated Asmat territory, and it just so happened that Father von Piege was also headed that way back to Atch. He told Michael that the best route to take at this time was by the way of the rivers. It was the longer route, but it was also the safer one, because the only other route to travel would be via the Arafura Sea, and during the month of November, that particular body of water, it could and would be unpredictable to travel. Father von Piege tried to convince Michael to follow him on the rivers, but Michael said no. He said he had too much to do. He had to stop in the village of Pur first. He had to check on the progress of his canoe that was being carved for him there. And he said, Von Piege, thanks for your concern. I know what I'm doing. I got my interpreter with me, and I'll see you later in the week when we stop in the village of Atch, where you are, stationed. So on the morning of Friday, November 17th, Michael and his little crew, including Renee Wassing and now 2 teenage Asmat guides, Simon, as well as another boy, Leo, they got into the catamaran, which was basically, like I said, just 2 canoes tied together with a little thatched roof above, and they sailed away. They arrived in Pur early the next afternoon. Michael checked on the progress of his canoe. He was pleased with how it was turning out, and the next morning they set out again, heading towards Atch, where they would meet up with Von Piege before heading towards Amanamakai, since they'd received word from Adrian Gerbrands that some of the Beige poles, the ancestor poles that Michael had purchased that previous June, had been delivered and were waiting for him there. According to Carl Hoffman, the author of the book Savage Harvest, Michael Rockefeller knew that the waters in this area could be dangerous as he glided towards the mouth of the Betz River, which led to the Arafura Sea. He knew that the weather could turn on a dime, especially in the months of December and November, when strong winds and currents caused even the Asmat, who had grown up navigating these rivers and tributaries, to take great care when out in their canoes. But Michael Rockefeller, he was a lot of things. He was well educated, and he could at times even be brilliant. He was young and passionate and eager to make a name for himself within and outside his family's legacy. But he was not an experienced boatsman, and neither was Renee Wassing or even the 2 Asmat teenagers who accompanied them, because they weren't men yet, right? They didn't really go out in the canoes on raids or on men trips. They didn't really know a lot about navigating these rivers from a very deep perspective. And they were also taught to respect their elders. They were taught to listen to men who were older than them, and both Michael and Renee were older than them. So Michael and Renee wanted to do it. Were they going to say no? The weather was sunny and clear that day. There was no warning that the wind was about to pick up and stir those waters into a frenzy. But Mother Nature doesn't owe us anything. She doesn't need to give us a heads up when she decides to change her mind. And after all, it is a woman's prerogative to change her mind. In a split second, the world turned upside down, and Michael's catamaran was tossed around like a tiny toy boat in an active child's bathtub. The sky turned dark and ominous, and large waves rose, crashing into the side of the boat and down upon its inhabitants. This introduction of water into the boat caused it to sink deeper into the water, deeper than it should have. And there was a small engine that was attached to the boat, but it was then flooded, causing it to groan and then go quiet, completely dead. The 2 teenage Asmat boys, Simon and Leo, they told Michael and Renee that they would need to immediately abandon ship and swim to shore while they were still in the river and close to the banks, or else they would be swept out to sea, and that would be the end of them all. But Renee Wassing, he was not a strong swimmer. He said, I don't know how to swim that well. I can't make it to the banks. And Michael refused to leave behind his sound and photography equipment, his film, and his carefully compiled notes, and all the things that he had purchased to use to barter for the treasures he was there to acquire. If those things were lost at sea, he might as well go with them. He'd planned too long and too hard for this. He'd created big dreams and high aspirations. He'd been writing to people back home about all the things he was going to do. And all of this was pinned on his ability to gather more artifacts, better ones, rare ones. How could he do that without something to offer in return? And he couldn't lose his film and his notes. He couldn't lose those things. The asthmatic teenagers dove into the river and began swimming towards land without a second thought, leaving Michael and Renee in the bucking catamaran. Later, Renee Wassing would tell the press, quote, "We were not at all in panic in the boat. Michael and I tried everything to keep the catamaran floating. We bailed and so on, but it all went so very quickly. A big part of the luggage came loose and floated away toward the ocean." End quote. Simon and Leo did set out to get help, but it was a long way to the nearest settlement, and they were on foot, so they didn't reach Agats until almost midnight, at which time a government boat was immediately sent out to locate the two men who were in great peril. But in a stroke of bad luck, this government boat ran out of gas as it sped towards the sea. Okay, so I'm going to hit you with a couple of names because we're going to talk about these people, these government officials, these officials from the church, and it's going to get confusing, and I will refresh your memory at the beginning of the next video. So you've got a guy named Theo Bot. He was the Dutch interior minister. You've also got a guy named P.J. Platiel. He was the governor of Dutch-occupied New Guinea. We also have a guy named Herman Tijlmans. He was basically the highest Catholic official in Dutch New Guinea. So all of these priests that we've talked about, he was essentially their boss's boss. And these are the guys out there pulling the strings, making the call on what happens next and what the general public hears about. Simon and Leo, they get to Agats. They tell the people what's going on. A boat goes out to rescue Michael and Renee, but it runs out of gas. It also didn't have a radio to let anyone know that it had run out of gas. But of course, word of the situation got to P.J. Platiel, the governor. He kicked it up to Theo Bot, who notified the U.S. State Department, who then notified Nelson Rockefeller. By late morning on the 19th of November, the morning after Simon and Leo had swam away from the catamaran, the Dutch Royal Air Force had already been aware of what was going on. They were mobilizing, trying to get everybody together, sending out ships, sending out planes, and they sent out 12 Lockheed Neptune planes. And before long, one of these planes would spot a capsized catamaran 24 miles away from the shore. But there was only one figure aboard this capsized boat. This figure was waving wildly at the plane, and it was not Michael Rockefeller. Renee would later say that after Simon and Theo had left the boat, the weather had calmed, the waves had subsided, but the catamaran was in bad shape, so he and Michael had climbed up onto the roof of the cabin to wait. They'd sat all night there until the sun began to rise at dawn, at which point they discovered they'd been swept out to sea. However, they could still see the coastline through the hazy and gray morning light, so all hope was not lost. Renee Wassing later told the media that most of their luggage and belongings had long since floated away, including their food, the camera equipment, pretty much everything. They sat there and waited until it became apparent that no help was coming. So Michael finally made the decision to swim to shore, which at that point Renee thought was only about 3 miles away. And Michael said, "I'll swim to shore and I'll get help." Renee Wassing would say that he'd tried to convince Michael not to swim away, but, quote, "Michael was too full of energy to remain on the boat with me. His restless nature made it impossible for him to endure our drifting around, and he left the boat, although I urged him not to." End quote. Michael had taken a rope and firmly tied 2 empty fuel tanks around his waist as a makeshift flotation device. He took a compass and a Swiss Army knife. He removed his pants and shoes, and he jumped into the sea. Renee watched him swim away until he could no longer see Michael's bobbing figure in the water, and later he would say, quote, "I could follow him for quite a while, a half hour or so. I saw him in a straight line going towards shore until I just saw 3 dots, the toucans, and his head." End quote. It had been a long time since they'd been gliding peacefully through the Betz River. It had been a long time since Michael and Renee had watched their teenage asthmatic guides jump into the river. It had taken Simon and Leo 11 hours to get to Agats. Michael and Renee had drifted all night, and then when Michael jumped into the sea around 9 a.m. that Sunday morning, it had taken another 22 hours for Renee to be spotted and rescued. It was estimated, based on the currents and the time of which Michael had jumped into the water to start swimming, their overturned catamaran was roughly just about 10 miles away from land. Now, no one knows exactly what happened to Michael Rockefeller after that, but a massive search would be mounted for him, with planes and helicopters and people in suits flooding an area that most people had never even heard of. And while that was happening, a story was spreading around the Asmat villages of a white man who had been pulled out of the sea and beheaded by a specific village who still had red in their ledger from a previous intrusion by the white man's government. And that is where we will pick up in the next and, I think, final video of this series. Thank you so much for being here. I know this video was probably a lot longer than the last video, but hopefully you see why I compiled it in this way. That first video was just sort of like context, setting the scene, getting you ready to understand what was happening here so that while we were going through the story, I didn't have to constantly go and say, like, this is why Michael shouldn't have, done this because the Asmat people are this. So that was just kind of like setting you up so that you would understand as we were going through what was really happening from sort of all angles. So thank you so much for being here. I hope you stay tuned for the conclusion where we're going to go over the search and also the theories, and then I want to discuss which one you think is more likely because honestly, I don't know. I think any one of them could be just as equally likely, but I do want to hear from you guys. So stay tuned for that. Don't forget to check out my coffee company, Criminal Coffee Company. I will link the website in the description box. You can order your coffee now. I definitely suggest getting the bundle and trying all three because I love all three. One's a light roast, one's a medium roast, one's a dark roast, but they're all very good. It just depends on your mood and your preference. I also would like you to follow me on Instagram and Twitter. Those links are in the description box as well. And follow my podcast, Crime Weekly, that I co-host every single week with former police detective Derek Levasseur. We are covering a new case right now, which I find to be very, very interesting. So go and check that out. Thank you so much for being here. Stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe, and I'll see you very soon. Bye.
Well, the levee don't break now, and the bottle's going straight down. And that river runs deep, the mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery. They're coming back from the grave, calling out my name, better say a Hail Mary. Well, you don't know how deep it goes until it's getting you slowly. And so you got to let it go. I got blood